Chapter 12. After the shock had worn off, and after I had time to work through my grief, I began to see how deeply Jesus had blessed me that night. Too many guys I know lost their parents when they were in prison. Their fathers and mothers only got to see the darkness. But for me, after 50 years of causing them heartache, they were able to see the good in me. 6 months before he died, I was able to tell my dad I'd given my life to Christ. Full of light for the first time in my life, I shared with him about my church and the things I was doing for Jesus. He never responded much. He'd nod or grunt, but didn't talk about it beyond that. It discouraged me for a while until my aunt took me aside at a family gathering. "I don't know what you did to him," she said, "but your faith in your church is all he ever talks about." Connection is the opposite of addiction, and God had connected me to my father. I am so grateful that God gave me that gift, that I could show my dad how I had changed. He and my mother never gave up hope. They believed in me even when I was at my worst. They saw good in me even when there wasn't any. 2 weeks before my 48th birthday, I walked out of prison. I didn't want to go to a halfway house because I was sober and needed to stay away from addicts. I had no friends. I had no money. I had no place to stay. My parents took me in, even though my dad had serious reservations. He knew as well as anyone what I had become. He knew I was violent. I was dangerous. I was a drug dealer. And he was right to be concerned. When I moved in with them, I wanted to stay sober, but I also needed to make my money back. I faced 12 months of intense supervised release. During that time, I had to check in daily. My caseworker knew exactly where I was going at all times and would even follow me to make sure. There was nothing I could do in ISR, but as soon as it ended, I planned to start cooking meth again. I wanted to be a sober drug dealer. That I figured was where the money was. But something happened during those 12 months. God started making connections in my life even before I gave my life to him. My dad was a good father, but like most men of his generation, he was a provider first. I grew up in a loving home, but my dad trusted my mom to raise the kids. His priority was bringing home a paycheck. Because he was always at work, we never developed much of a relationship. When I moved back after prison, however, we had no choice but to spend time together. He was retired, and I wasn't allowed to leave the house except for work and AA meetings. Like me, my dad worked construction his whole life, but his back and knees didn't work as well as they used to, so he had some projects around the house that he could no longer do. During the day, I tore the steps off his deck and put in sonic tubes. As I worked, he stood nearby. We talked about the work, about the day, about whatever. My dad had a back room in his house. There were no TVs, no cell phones, no noise. In the evenings, he'd sit in the rocker and I'd be in the recliner. We'd listen to the wind push against the house. We'd watch the squirrels. We talked about the twins, about the news, about whatever. A month before the end of my probation, I started buying stuff for my new place. A friend had offered rental property. We had never discussed my moving out, but one morning my dad found me in the kitchen eating breakfast. He took the chair next to me and watched me quietly for a few minutes. "Dennis," he said, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, "you don't have to leave, son. We have plenty of room." I looked at him, a lump growing in my throat. I had moved in as an ex-con. In my heart, I had still been a drug dealer. I was a dangerous man, and my dad wasn't sure if it was a good idea to have me at home. But God had made it so everything changed. I finally knew my father, and he knew me. I was grateful beyond words, and part of me would have loved to stay with him and Mom, but I was almost 50 years old. I needed my own space. I thanked him, but shook my head. My new relationship with my father changed me. As I packed up my stuff, I no longer had any plans to go back cooking or selling drugs. I couldn't imagine living that life anymore. I couldn't do that to my dad.